it may be challenging just to turn that off, right? Because now I'm going in a heightened state, and there are other things happening. Like our emotions aren't just mental, right? And I know that you're familiar with this, where if I'm stressed and cortisol is dripping and that type stuff, well, I may act differently in that meeting, and it's not something I can just turn on and off. So I do agree that to a certain extent, we do have, like, if we're aware of it and there's some techniques we can use to calm down, maybe. And I'm not convinced that that's always the case.
The greatest good you can do for another is not just to share your riches, but to reveal to him his own. That's a quote by Benjamin Disraeli. And my guest today, Ray Ciafardini, or better known as my coach Ray, his passion is to live out this quote, to help people achieve their goals, overcome their blocks, and be their best selves. Ray, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Keenan. I appreciate you having me today.
It's an honor. And Ray achieves this through a method called NLP coaching. What is that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question to get us started. So NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming, so abbreviated to NLP. And NLP was developed back in the early 70s. And what the co-creators did was they studied successful individuals, people who are successful at helping other people create change. Hypnotherapists, social workers, people of that nature, and a few others. And what they did was they started to look at how the language we use, how our programming and how our behaviors are connected. So neuro, we have the brain, we have linguistics, that's the language, and then programming, those are those deep-seated beliefs and values and things of that nature, and how all of those come together to produce our behaviors and how we go about living our lives.
Okay, and what's the relationship between the three? So it's not just
Sure,
called
yeah.
neural coaching or linguistic programming, like it's all three together.
Sure, that's a great question. And for this, I'm going to refer to something in neurolinguistic programming. We call it the NLP model of communication. So I'd like you to imagine this. There's an external event of some sort. I'm going to keep it simple, and we're going to say that that external event is simply me saying the word dog. Now, when I say the word dog, something most likely pops into your head. Now, your listeners, as they hear me say the word dog, something most likely pops into their head. So what ends up happening is there's an external event, in this case, me saying the word dog, and then that goes through a bunch of filters. We delete, we distort, and we generalize information based on things like memories, beliefs, values, attitudes, things of that nature. So when I say the word dog, it goes through all those filters in your mind, and then we form what's called an internal representation. So this internal representation, let's say you like dogs and you happen to think of, a puppy that's jumping on your leg and it's, you're having a good time with a dog in your mind's eye. Well, then what ends up happening is that may put you in a positive state, which then affects your physiology. Maybe you smile, you stand up a little bit straighter, and between that internal representation, that state, and then your physiology, that produces a behavior. Now, let's say someone doesn't like dogs, and I say the word dog, and then they think of maybe a big scary dog that was barking at them when they were little. Well, that too, that internal representation of the dog is going to affect their state. Maybe they're now afraid. Maybe they, drop their shoulders a little bit, and then that produces a behavior. Now, this internal representation, this is made up of more than just the visual. So we have the visual. Then we have also the auditory. There may be sounds associated with it. There's a kinesthetic. There may be a feeling associated with it. We also have the olfactory, which is smell, and the gustatory, which is taste. Now, generally thinking about a dog, maybe those don't come up as much. Visual, auditory, and kinesthetic are three, often the primary ways that we represent these things. And then we also have our, what we call in neurolinguistic programming, the auditory digital. That's the self-talk. So that's us talking to ourselves. So all of these things are going on in our, I'll say our mind's eye, recognizing that it is more than just visual. Then we have a state and a physiology, and those three play off of one another, and that produces a behavior. So when we start to work with those filters and work with our states and internal representations and our physiology, we can change the way we operate in the world.
Okay, a lot of it sounds very experiential, like based on what somebody's experience prior to a certain event was. So again, like the example of the dog, I would imagine, if I look at the development of a child, the first time a child sees a dog, it doesn't know what it is, and then somebody will explain to it, no, that is a dog, and it will see four legs, ears, and whiskers. But then what happens when a child sees a cat? Then they'll initially first think, oh, that's also a dog, until somebody explains to them, no, you see, this is not a dog, it's a cat, this is what is different. That's a similar thing I'm getting with all the senses. Based on your experience, it shapes how you see things that come thereafter, based on the sound, smell, taste, what you see as you have described.
Yes, and please, and I guess to clarify for your listeners, I am not saying that everything is simply our nurture, right? There is a nature element of this. There are certain things that genetically do play a role in how we develop. So if we were to break this up, we could say that there's nurture, right? The way we're raised, our environment, the things we learn. There is nature. There are genetics that do play a role in, for example, in some of the research that I've read on personality, right? Some of that has been shown to be genetic. And then if we wanted to take something, if someone has a religious background, something like a soul, right? Well, all three of those, depending on someone's belief system, would develop them into the person they are. And along the way, we have these idiosyncratic events that do change the way that we potentially see the world and operate. If it's okay, Keenan, I'd like to give a quick example of how people can respond to different events. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, go ahead, shoot.
So this idea of using this idea of a dog, right? This idea of a positive or what I'll label as a negative response, recognizing that if someone is afraid of a dog, that's probably coming from a positive intention, right? Like maybe they had a scary thing and then now they just want to be safe. So they don't, they're afraid of dogs. That's fine. And there was a famous hypnotherapist years ago. And what he did when working with clients, a client would come to him or a prospect would come to him and say, I want to lose weight, but I can't lose weight. And what he would say is, hey, I'm cool working with you. And before we start working together, I need you to gain 11 pounds. And what would happen is some people, they'd go out and they would gain 11 pounds. And then they would come back and they're like, yeah, I gained 11 pounds. He goes, great. And his goal in doing that was to show them that they did have control over their weight. So that was a win in those cases. And then other people, they would have a polar response and they would actually lose the weight. And then that's what they were looking for. So, I was speaking to someone the other day and they were talking about, we were having a similar conversation and they brought up the idea of smoking, that someone may early on in their life, they may be told that smoking is bad, they don't like the smell, that type of stuff. And then that creates a response to where when they grow up, they don't smoke. Well, that same person could potentially hear all of those things about how smoking is bad, it's not good for you, and those types of things. And then what ends up happening is they're like, oh, my parents told me smoking wasn't good. I'm going to do it because they told me not to. So people have different responses to these things based on those things, nature, nurture, and, the things that happen to us, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, it's not just what is said or what is done to you, it's how you respond to it. It's, again, the example, both people had the same goal. It was put on 11 pounds. And, even if I think just giving somebody that as a goal, if it's counterintuitive to what they wanted to do, either way, they're going to win in the end. Because if you put on the weight, well, that's what your goal was. If you lose the weight, well, that's what your ultimate goal was. And again, like the example with the smoking as well, it's some people, or how you respond to somebody telling you smoking is bad it will differ. Like if somebody has a good relationship with their parents, they will want to maintain it. You're going to think twice about doing it. But if, your parents are the bane of your existence, then why are you going to do what they want you to do? They're not somebody that you respect or you actually care about their opinion. And then it also goes into, if you do start smoking, then you're going to feel bad about it because you were told. So, there's a big emotional component I'm also seeing playing here. It's not just completely irrational, where you have this experience and then this action is like programmed to happen, then how does emotion tie into this?
That's a great question. And I want to make sure I articulate this in a way that does. I like to stay in my lane when it comes to personal development, right? So when it comes to emotions, we can say something like guilt, for example. That, and I guess I should start off by saying that there's no such thing as a positive or negative emotion. That we have our emotions for a reason and they're designed to do something. Now, can there be an unhealthy expression of emotion? Absolutely. Can there be a disproportionate or unwarranted amount of an emotion given a specific situation? I think most people would agree so. So we can look at something like guilt, where we can say that guilt, people often feel guilty if they violate one of their values. So let's say that, Keenan, you and I are friends, and in a friendship, I value integrity. And then I were to do something to cheat you out of something. Well, guilt could be derived from that action of violating one of my values. So anger, for example, if I get angry and storm off in the middle of a conversation rather than throwing a punch, well, that anger causes me to storm off. We could say that, yeah, excessive anger, sure, can lead to challenges, health problems, and things of that nature. And whenever there's a healthy expression of an emotion, well, I think most people would agree that we have those for a reason, and that can lead to positive outcomes. So, if I feel guilty, well, then I may need to course correct. I may need to say, hey, where am I violating my values? What can I do differently next time to make sure that I don't create this guilt? So emotions absolutely play a role in it. And there's a coaching model out there that says something along the lines of, if you want to change your results, you have to change your actions. And if you want to change your actions, well, change your emotions. And if you want to change your emotions, change your thoughts. What NLP brings to the table in this model is to say that if you want to change your thoughts, well, change your programming, right? Because our thoughts are coming from our programming. Well, if we were to just look at the model works, just generally speaking. And the thing about thoughts and emotions, the way that we respond to things, from what I've read, it's that those two things don't always go in that order. There's something called, for example, like amygdala hijacking, where, before any conscious thought, you see a bear, right? For example, there are some things going on below the surface. You respond potentially with fear rather than thinking, oh, it's a bear. There are things going on below the surface, and consciously, we don't always recognize those thoughts. So I hope that answers your question, how emotions can play into these things.
Yeah, no, it definitely answers it. And when you spoke about amygdala hijacking, it reminded me of conversation I had recently about how scam artists take advantage of that, putting you in a certain emotional state to elicit the response. Yeah, and with emotions also, it's, emotions tell us a lot more about ourselves than those around us. It communicates what you find upsetting or pleasurable, or again, like guilt itself, it also has a use because, guilt is telling you this is not something that aligns with your values. It's telling you that there might be consequences for this, or I don't like this feeling. It's not something that I feel I should be doing. Yeah, and there are appropriate responses to emotions. Emotions don't determine how you act. They only determine what you feel in a moment, how you're interpreting it. Yeah, how you act is up to you, and that can be influenced by a bunch of factors going on inside of your mind.
Yeah, I might push back on that a little bit. That, for example, I'm a big fan of Robert Sapolsky, and you or some of your listeners may be familiar with him. And I heard him on a recent podcast, and I've read some of his work too, and he talks about, for example, that the smell of garbage, right? The smell of garbage may heighten someone, we'll say, like someone may be more willing to fight, like fight someone with the smell of garbage around. Now, I'm using that as an example, and please, people can fact check me on this, and please don't hold me to, Ray said that if I smell garbage, I'm more likely to fight. It is something along those lines, and I bring this up to say that our actions are not all, well, depending on belief systems here, I'll be a little vague on this, that there are conditions that drive our actions that we are consciously unaware of. that, for example, let's say that you're sitting in traffic and, one day you're in traffic and it's a good day, right? Windows down, sunny outside, listening to some good music, and no big deal. Well, the next day you're sitting in the same traffic, and this time you're just a little bit late. Well, now what happens? You're frustrated, right? Maybe you're upset. Maybe you're yelling at people. Same exact conditions. Windows down, music on, sunny out. It's nice out, and by virtue of what we're moving toward, by virtue of what our goal is, well, things change those conditions. And then if I'm in that traffic and I'm angry, and then I walk into a meeting, it may be challenging just to turn that off, right? Because now I'm going in a heightened state, and there are other things happening. Like our emotions aren't just mental, right? And I know that you're familiar with this, where if I'm stressed and cortisol is dripping and that type stuff, well, I may act differently in that meeting, and it's not something I could just turn on and off. So I do agree that to a certain extent, we do have, like, if we're aware of it and there's some techniques we can use to calm down, maybe. And I'm not convinced that that's always the case. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's also, even if it's you in a certain state or mood, it's not just that simple as you go and flip a switch. I'm angry now, let me just go and do something, let me just do a quick meditation and suddenly I'm going to be happy. There is some sort of give and take that has to go along. And yeah, another thing with emotions, if you actively try to suppress an emotion, it actually makes that emotion worse for yourself. If you're angry and you try to deny that you are angry or suppress it as much as you can, it's not just anger anymore. Then it's shame about your anger. You make it a more complex emotion than to, own it in the moment, be aware of it, and try and understand what it is. But that's also not as easy said as it's not as easy done as it is said, because, well, you've seen with emotions, if you get angry, it's very easy to get blinded. Or if you're feeling down in the dumps, it's very easy, like people always say, practice gratitude. But it's kind of tough to see gratitude when everything around you looks bleak and dark.
Yeah, I think that's why in the history of telling someone to calm down, no one has actually ever calmed down, right? They normally get more upset. So yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to stop anybody from trying to find that one person that does actually calm down ultimately.
That's true.
So back to the model of communication in terms of NLP. How does somebody apply that to themselves? Like, how do they become more conscious of it?
That's a great question. So you had mentioned this idea of that our emotions, they can build up almost. My words, not exactly your words there. So I'd like you to imagine this, and this is going to tie in another technique that I use that's in my toolkit called mental and emotional release. So let's say, for example, we have something that happens, and then we notice that we have a certain response to it. And let's call it a disproportionate response. Well, if I start to become aware of these things, of what's happening, or another way of looking at this is if I start to notice certain beliefs arising through my actions. And what I mean by that is that if we want to know what people believe, we need to watch what they do, right? Not what they say, it's what they do, because we live out our beliefs. If I think it's going to rain, or if I believe it's going to rain, I may grab an umbrella on the way out the door, right? Now, if you were to know that my belief was that I believe that umbrellas are only used for fighting, and you saw me grab an umbrella, you could reasonably expect that I think that there's going to be a fight, right? So based on my belief systems, that's going to dictate how I act. Beliefs and values help deliver on those things. So if I see myself acting a certain way, and I can become aware of this. So an external event happens, stuff goes through my filter, and then it produces a certain response, I can start to become aware of those things, right? And this is also why I'm a coach, because I think sometimes we can't always see ourselves, right? So it's good to have a third-party perspective there. So if we can't be aware of it, this is one of the areas where coaching and other and other things can help. So once I become aware of those things, then I can start to make moves to shift my beliefs or potentially work with my values and create different behaviors that are going to help me move toward my desired outcome. It's only through the recognition, or not only through, and one of the ways of doing this is through the recognition of what our beliefs, values, attitudes, things like that are producing this behavior based on what we talked about earlier by creating that internal representation, affecting our state and affecting our physiology.
Yeah, and it's not just a one-way street. I'm getting. It's not just our beliefs determine our actions. It's also, yeah, I would imagine that our actions also influence our beliefs. Like, say, you have one day, you're walking down the street and you see a dog, and your initial reaction normally is to go and pet the dog because you know you like dogs, they're friendly. So you go and rub it, and that tends to be your default action. Then one day you have an experience where this one dog that you decide to go rub has had the worst day imaginable, and he decides to take it out on you, and he snaps at you, and you know it changes your whole approach to it. Then suddenly it becomes, okay, I'm not going to rub any dog. Any dog I see, I avoid.
Right. And yes, that's why we have this. We have something in neurolinguistic programming that we call the 5 principles of success. That first we have to know what we want, then we take action on it. Then we have something called sensory acuity. It's an awareness of what's going on around us. Then, based on whether or not it's working or not working, then we exhibit some behavioral flexibility. That's just creating options for ourselves. And then the bubble around all of that is operate from a physiology and psychology of excellence. So we can put that one aside for a moment, though. So in that case, if someone's goal, for example, if they know what they want and that's to pet all dogs, and then they take action on it, and one of those dogs, they wag their tail, no big deal. They can follow, they can just do what they normally do. If someone, for example, knows they want to pet dogs and they pet dog, that's the action. They take action on it. They pet the dog, and then the dog snaps at them. Well, sensory acuity says, hey, I may need to adjust my model of the world because not all dogs are as friendly as I thought. And then maybe they form a different approach. In the example you gave, yes, maybe they just avoid all dogs. Other people may just be a little more cautious or ask the owner. So yes, there is something to that our models do update as we take action. And it's important that we are aware of what those outcomes are based on the actions we take so we can create different options for ourselves.
How does somebody know what is a good change to make? Because on the one hand, it's, somebody would go for coaching if they see, oh, I want to change this about me. But knowing whether something is a good change to make is a different thing. Like the example with the dog again. Is it really a bad thing if I don't go and approach every single dog because I'm scared? Well, I would imagine, okay, maybe you still like dogs, so you'd want to change it that you maybe see, oh, this is a good dog to approach and that is not. So how does somebody know what is a conducive change?
That's a great question. I can start by saying, based on beliefs and values, we're going, like, as we do things, we do have somewhat of an internal compass, right? That if we feel guilt or if we feel joy or things of that nature, we do have somewhat an internal compass there. Big picture, though, this is why some of these models really matter. That, let's say, for example, I do get, a dog snaps at me, right? So now I make the decision to say that, well, now I'm just not going to pet any dogs. Then I start going through life not petting any dogs, and I see dogs from a distance, and then I start to say, you know what? I just don't feel as happy as I was. I see a dog, I want to pet it. Now I don't. I'm not feeling the joy that I used to experience. Cool. Well, now maybe I can adjust and say, well, I know what I want. I want to pet some dogs. Well, then I can, take action, whatever that is. Maybe it's talk to the owner first, and then we can keep running these 5 principles of success. So if I'm always working this system, knowing what I want, taking action, having sensory acuity, being aware of what's going on, and then adjusting accordingly, having some behavioral flexibility, and I operate from this physiology and psychology of excellence, if I'm running that pattern over and over and over again, and I'm course correcting and developing new models of the world and strategies, I can figure some things out. I may not always get it right, and if I'm constantly aware of this and I'm adjusting, I may eventually get it right, right?
Okay, it's taking somebody away from that all or nothing mindset to, this is looking at things more in context, taking everything into account, how you feel, what is going on around you, not isolating things all on their own.
Right. There's a So one of the presuppositions in neurolinguistic programming, we have a list of presuppositions. These are, we'll call them convenient assumptions. And one of those is the law of requisite variety. This comes to us from cybernetics, and we apply this to people. So what the law of requisite variety states, as we apply it to people, is something along the lines of the person with the most options or the person with the most flexibility has the greatest influence over their environment. So if I was in sales for years, and if I were to apply this to a salesperson, if a salesperson goes into a presentation with a prospect and they only have one way of handling an objection and they get that objection, well, if that way that they know doesn't work, they don't get the sale. They don't make the sale. If they have multiple ways of handling the prospect's objection, they're more likely to make the sale. So by having multiple options or creating flexibility in how we think, we'll have greater influence over the environment or what's happening in our lives. So flexibility and creating options for ourselves absolutely matters.
Okay, it sounds like if somebody is a very autonomous person, they are more likely to be successful because, on the one hand, it's not just they thinking, how can things go right? They're also looking at the multiple ways they themselves can make things go right.
Right. And having worked with clients, there are some things that I just didn't like my clients wanted to do, and I didn't think they were going to work, and I let them give it a try, right? Because we're running this model, and there are, sometimes we surprise ourselves with what does work and what doesn't.
Yeah, and there's a saying by Sean Puri that I like, and it's pessimists get to be right, optimists get to be rich. And the idea behind it is somebody that's optimistic is going to actually go and try do the thing, that they want to. And in doing it, even if they aren't good at it first, they become better at it over time just by engaging in the action. And the book you recommended, we can speak a bit about it afterwards. I started reading a bit of it, and it spoke to that, the practicing mind. So through the action of engaging with it repeatedly, practicing, but having like sort of an aim for practicing, but not just that aim, but also, something intermediate steps that you do enjoy helps you work towards that end goal. And if you do not have in your mind already that this is a possibility or an option on the table, you blind yourself to it. You're not going to even think about doing anything for that possibility because in your mind it's pointless doing that action. You're going to be just doing it for no reason whatsoever. What about practice? Because a lot of that sounds like it deals with repeated actions that you're speaking about.
Yeah, two quick comments. I appreciate about that quote about optimism and pessimism. I heard something similar that the optimist builds the plane, the pessimist builds the parachute, and I think that they play off one another. And I think also, and I think that this is where personality and understanding different personality traits is so important that. I appreciate that idea, like the optimist becomes rich, and I forget what you said happens to or they can be right, and then the optimist becomes rich. And I think there's something to that. And I think that's also a reflection of what society values, because the pessimist also has the opportunity to potentially stay alive longer, because there's a difference thinking back to like caveman days. There was the difference between the person who braved it and went through the jungle, and then the pessimist who will say went around the outside. They may have stayed alive longer. So I think just because society doesn't reward something doesn't mean that the traits that we have aren't necessarily helpful in some way. As far as practice goes, to get to your question, please forgive me for that tangent, that when it comes to the practice, yes, it is there. And there have been different experiments done on this or studies. I think both words could fit there, where they had they had people practicing rather than just trying to do it perfectly at first. And the people, I believe they did this with a photography class. It was the people who took the most pictures ended up with the better pictures rather than the ones who were just looking for the best pictures right off the bat, because the quality was in the quantity. And if I'm just willing to experiment and try things that, this, we could almost look at it using Carol Dweck's language of a open mind versus a closed mind, like that type of mindset. That yes, when people are open to it and they're okay to try things out, and this is another presupposition of NLP, that there is no such thing as failure, there's only feedback. Well, if I do something and it doesn't work, that's just giving me feedback, right? And then it's important to give it enough time and things like that. And that's probably a longer conversation. And yeah, that idea of practicing, and one of the examples that Thomas Sterner uses in the book is that if I have 3 wadded up pieces of paper and I want to throw them into a wastebasket across the room, well, if I look at it and say, well, I have to get all 3 in, if I miss one, I've already failed on the goal. Whereas if it's just the idea of practicing to get better in everything I do, I may throw the first one, I may overshoot. So then I know the second one I need to pull back a little bit. If I pull back too much, maybe I fall short. And then finally I land the third one in the basket. If we look at things as practice, yes, it takes off some of the, I don't know, maybe stress or anxiety around what that is. And if we do happen to fall short, we know it's just feedback, and then we can move forward accordingly.
I wasn't aware of the photography example, but if I look at the story of Picasso, that's pretty much what he did. Like every day he painted a lot. So every day you would paint at least 2 paintings without fail. And, on the one hand, it might be this guy was so naturally gifted, but the other hand, it could be both together. There's the nurture side where he has this innate aptitude for it, and then there's also the nurture component. So you touched on a bit there with the personality. How much leeway do you think somebody has to change their personality? Like with NLP, how big influence would it have?
That's a great question. And I think that this is a little bit out of my lane, so I'll comment on it. And, of course, I encourage people to dig deep on this, that, I think there is sometimes some confusion around what the different personality traits are. So, for example, when we look at the big 5 personality traits, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Let's take something like extroversion, and then the opposite would be introversion, right? And I think, one, it's important to look at these on a spectrum, and context absolutely matters. So we look at these on a spectrum, and context matters, like where someone is, what the function is, or whatever that, or whatever the context is. So there are people out there, like, for example, I like, if we're looking at a spectrum, when I've taken personality tests and things of that nature, I would fall on the introverted side of that spectrum. Now, a couple things. One, I have no trouble speaking in front of large groups. I have no trouble speaking on a podcast like this. I have no trouble interacting with people. I have no trouble at something like, let's take a networking event where, I'm not the one bouncing from every person, and I have no trouble introducing myself to strangers, right? And I think sometimes we look at these personality traits and we without, I think understanding is the right word, that someone may look at me in one of those functions, say, no, Ray's an extrovert, when sometimes people look at an introvert, what they think is like a social anxiety or something like that, when that's not what the personality trait necessarily dictates. Because you could have an extrovert who still has some form of social anxiety. It's different than what the personality trait is. So, can someone change behavior despite their personality? I believe so. I think their behavior can change. How they feel about it, that's going to be different in the individual. That if an extrovert has to bounce from person to person at a networking event, great. And they may love that. They may be energized. If an introvert has to do it, they may be able to do it. It just may take more energy. It may feel more draining for them because they don't get energy from that necessarily. So I don't think our personality traits are an excuse not to do something necessarily. I think that how we feel about it, and yes, play to our strengths, absolutely, right? Play to our strengths, absolutely. And I think that when it comes to the personality traits, I don't know how much they change, so to speak, or whether or not NLP could make someone change from like an extrovert to an introvert, and it can have an influence over behavior.
Okay, so it's not changing the person themselves, it's changing their beliefs about something, their approach to it. Like if you're not the social person, increasing your tolerance or learning techniques or approaches that are conducive to you, learning how to empower, the way you are as opposed to changing the way you are.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of saying it. When I mentioned I was in sales, both B2C, business to consumer, and B2B, business to business. And I had to make a lot of phone calls. And those phone calls, I didn't make them super, like, I wasn't excited to talk to a lot of people. Like that wasn't what got me on the phone. I was very systematic to say, hey, I know that if I talk to this many people, it's going to yield this many appointments, which is going to yield this many sales, for example. So that I was able to do the job. It just wasn't necessarily driven by the same thing. So yes, behavior or working with beliefs and attitudes and things of that nature, yes.
Okay, yeah, and it's like a good analogy, I think, is a computer. You'd have a computer and it has certain hardware on it. You can't change the hardware. Let's say it is a laptop and it has these default specs and there's nothing you can do to change it. It is immutable. The way you can still change what it does is changing programming. You can run a different operating software, or based on how intense the change you want is. If it's not that major, you can switch the program you use. Instead of Microsoft Word, you maybe use Google Docs or something else. Is like, as much as the laptop is what it is, you can still change the way you do things on it. You mentioned the 5 proponents of success, I think you said it was. What are they? So you mentioned them like in between. Can you maybe give them listed out?
Sure, absolutely. So know what you want. You have to know what you want. And I want to be clear that that's different than knowing what you don't want. That, for example, if I just don't want to be broke, that's different than I desire to be wealthy. Because if I'm, for example, looking for a job, I'm going to take a much different job if I just don't want to be broke than if I desire to be wealthy. I'll settle for a job that's just that'll potentially going to that'll give me any money, rather than a job where I can progress and things of that nature. So knowing what you want is important. And it's funny, and maybe you're familiar with it, maybe you've experienced this, that it's not uncommon when you ask people why they're doing what they're doing, like, what are you doing this for? And they're like, well, I just don't want this, right? And, why are you losing weight, or why are you working out? Well, I just don't want to be squishy, or I just don't want to be overweight. They know what they don't want. They just don't know what they do want. So knowing what you want is the first key to this. So that's the first principle. The second one is taking action. So once we know what we want, we have to take action on it. And in neuro-linguistic programming, we really emphasize this idea of modeling, that we model like if someone else has what we want, we model them. And it's more than just what they're doing. It's things like beliefs and values, and we have techniques to install those in people. So we know what we want, we take action on it, then we have sensory acuity. That's an awareness of what we're doing, whether or not it's moving us closer toward our desired outcome or further away from it. And this is another reason why models are so important. Because if someone says, for example, okay, cool, you want a 6-pack, I have a 6-pack, you need to eat this way and go to the gym for 6 months and do these exercises, and then you'll have a 6-pack, cool. Well, if I don't know that and I go to the gym once and do like 10 crunches and I walk out without a 6-pack, well, then I could say, well, this doesn't work. So we need to have some time frame, right? Or we need to have some model to base that on. So then that sensory acuity is an awareness of what I'm doing, whether or not it's working or not working. Then if it is working, I just stay the course. If it's not working, this is where the fourth principles of success, this is have behavioral flexibility. And this goes back to that law of requisite variety, that the person with the most flexibility or the most options has the greatest influence over their environment, right? Over the system. Okay. So then if, let's say I do follow that 6 months, eat right, do the exercises, and that plan didn't work for me, well, now I might need to change things up. I might need to find another plan that's more suitable for my body type, blood type, that type stuff. Well, then, So know what you want, take action, have sensory acuity, have behavioral flexibility. And then kind of the bubble around those four is going to be the fifth principle, and that's operate from a physiology and psychology of excellence. So physiology, that's healthy body. And then a psychology of excellence, we'll call it healthy mind, if you will, right? That body and mind.
So it's looking at the two together, how they influence each other and interact with one another.
It is. And and I guess to backtrack for just a moment, your example of like the hardware in the computer, right? Well, this is where, yes, by working with our mind, we can change our physiology. That if I were to, for example, if someone is experiencing anxiety over a certain aspect of their job, and we can move around some beliefs and values and things of that nature, and then they don't feel that anxiety, well, their body will change, right? Physically change, because if they're less stressed, less cortisol and things of that nature, all of those things change physically, less stress hormones, that type stuff. So yes, physically they are changing in that aspect. And then if someone just simply changes their posture, changes how they hold themselves, that changes their mindset. There was this, I'm paraphrasing this, and this is another book that I recommend, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And he talks about, it looks like you're familiar with it.
System 1 and System 2 thinking, yeah.
Perfect. And you may be familiar with this idea of they had people that held a pencil underneath their nose, and by doing that, it forced a smile. Right? It's a fake smile. And what they found is that people did respond differently based on that physiology than if they weren't smiling. So, they do play with one another, and that can create long-term changes, brain chemistry, body chemistry, and things of that nature. So I would never claim that NLP, I think that this is a safe statement. I would never claim that NLP by itself would directly change the hardware, because it doesn't work with that part. Like, we aren't doing anything physically to the brain or the body. And by adjusting those things can absolutely change physically. That I do believe.
Yeah, it's both upward regulation and downward regulation. You can either change the way you feel in the moment, like your body, do breathing and that sort of things to change your thoughts and behaviors, or you can do the other way around, change the thoughts to change the body. And I think doing it where you first get the physical side of things, it kind of gives you positive reinforcement. A good example is the gym. Like for guys, if you go and you do weight training and you get a nice pump, a pump is sort of a preview of what you're going to look like in 3 months without the pump. You get a glimpse of, oh, if I continue to do this diligently, that is what I'll look like eventually. And losing weight, or, when you look in the mirror and you see that change, it's impossible not to see that change and feel good. That all the work you put in was well worth it, because something like that is hard to quantify, but qualitatively it will definitely show in the mirror. And if I think about behavioral flexibility, it's also somebody trying to lose weight. If they just take one approach and it does not work for them, because my experience with training is there's not a one size fits all approach to things. For some people, one thing works better than the other. And I've seen where guys will try doing the same workout as another guy and not get the same response. And then they switch it up where they maybe train like a muscle once a week, and it makes a big difference for them. If you do not have that flexibility to say, oh, this didn't work, okay, what other potential possibilities are there? And then have that, not just the intention, but actually follow through on it. You're going to believe that, oh, because I've just tried this, there's no way to do it. You increase your chances of success the more cards you have to play.
I agree. And I'm going to throw in two little things there. One, that, and this going back to that idea of knowing what you want, right? It is very common for people to say lose weight, right? And, if we know what we want, this would be weigh X amount, that we're moving toward what we desire rather than away from. And what's fascinating is that that is also what promotes the long-term success of the goal. That if someone just says lose weight, well, as soon as they lose weight, they may go back to old habits, right? It's like if someone says, well, I just don't want to be broke, well, then they start making some money, then they can go back to old habits. It's the weigh X amount, it's the save X amount. So that language, even in something as simple as lose weight, matters. And then there's another model I'd like to introduce here, because there may be people, Keenan, who hear that say, well, I just don't feel like going to the gym. Like that never works anyways. So I hear what Keenan says about the pump, and it doesn't get them to the gym, right? So there's another model, and this is the first model that I use with clients, and these are the 4 requisites for change. That the 4 requisites for change are release work, create a compelling future, take action, and maintain focus. So this is kind of a meta model over everything I do with clients. So, please forgive me. In neuro-linguistic programming, we have something called a meta model. I mean a meta model meaning like this is the all-encompassing model that everything I do with clients, this is what it fits into. So release work, we start with release work, and this is where that technique that I mentioned earlier, like mental and emotional release, would come in, where we release limiting beliefs, emotional baggage, and some other things so people can move forward unencumbered by their past. Then we create the compelling future. This is the crafting a goal. It's a little more detailed than that, and we'll just say it's setting a goal. Then people take action, and that's where the 5 principles of success come in. Then they have to maintain focus on what it is they desire to create. It's focusing on what they want rather than what they don't want. So the reason I'm introducing this model here is that there are situations where, and I recently wrote an article I've written articles in the past on this, how I find that it's not uncommon for successful people to have a hard time articulating what it is that created their success and then teaching it to other people. So because they come up with reasons why they were successful when it may in fact have nothing to do with those things. So
it's more justification than an explanation.
Correct. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Right. It may have been one connection that they had that, it's easy to say the reason I was successful was because I worked hard and I was good to people. Okay. That may be true. I'm not denying that hard work can create success. And I know a lot of people that work exceptionally hard and still don't achieve success. So there's more. I believe there's more to it than that. So by going through this process that someone may hear, well, if you want to feel better, you need to work out. Well, if part of their programming is something like, well, I worked out for a decade and my life still wasn't great, so I'm not going to work out. That's a lot of what I work with is below the surface, that it's not just conscious thought. So without diving too much into my belief system and other views outside of neuro-linguistic programming, our programming is below the surface. Like right now, so many things are happening to you, to me, to your listeners, where you're blinking, you're breathing, your heart's beating. Well, those are the things that we know are happening that we aren't controlling. Well, there are a lot of things in our mind that are happening that we're not controlling. Just like when I say dog, if someone instantly feels happy, they didn't control that. If they instantly felt afraid, they didn't control that either. So that idea of the programming is driving those things, that it's not, if we just had conscious control over everything all the time, I think a lot of people would lead much different lives, and some would argue much better lives, if I could just snap my fingers and say, for example, I'm not afraid of spiders, I'm not afraid of snakes, I'm not afraid of heights. Well, it just doesn't work like that because there's stuff below the surface.
Yeah, it's looking at the root cause as opposed to the symptoms, Sure, this might be the thing, like, again, bringing it back to people's goals, like saying, my goal is to lose weight. No, that is maybe a means to an end. But what is the ultimate reason for losing weight? Is it because somebody made you feel bad about your weight? Is it you're not feeling worthy of anything because of your weight? And it makes a big difference, because let's say you do lose the weight and you still feel that same way, then you're just going to put it all back on because it's going to feel like, oh, this was so pointless. Then you go back to that state again, and then you start feeling, oh, I'm a failure. I couldn't even keep all this weight off, or whatever it is. And identifying the root cause requires a lot more work. Like, it's a lot easier to, see the car's not working and then be like, oh, if I push the car will move. No, the point is you want the car to be driven by itself, not somebody pushing it constantly.
Right. Yeah, I love that example. One of the examples I've shared with people in the past is, let's say you have a racehorse and you have weights on the racehorse. Well, that racehorse is going to run as fast as it can with the weights on it. Let's say you put a jockey on it, and the jockey starts pushing the horse harder, and it may start to move faster. When if we had just taken the weights off to begin with, the horse would have moved faster. And that's what release work, like I generally speaking, release work, that's what releasing those things at the unconscious level, that's what it does. It takes the weights off. That's why we set the goal after the release work.
Okay, so it's like opening a valve for a tap. Like, when you start, this valve is pretty closed and not much water flows through it, but through the release work, you open it more and it flows.
That's so cool that you just use that idea of a valve, because one of the pictures that I paint for people is this idea of a pipe, right? So imagine that you have a pipe and you have 4 different parts of it. You have the spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical part of the pipe. Well, at any one of those levels, there may be a clog. A spiritual clog, a mental clog, an emotional clog, or a physical clog, which prevents the flow of water. Well, it's not. I've had people come to me and like, hey, can you fix me? Right? Can you fix me? I'm broken. Sometimes people use that language, and it's my belief that no one's broken. They just may have clogs at one of those levels. And you're right. Like, the way that you use that idea of things flowing when the valve opens, I'm just a believer that once we get rid of those clogs, we can use a water pipe. Water's going to flow both ways with much greater ease. So when I'm working with clients, wherever that clog is, I use spiritual, mental, emotional, physical in this example, and the clog may be in the relationship area of their life. The clog may be in the financial area of their life. They may have limiting beliefs or something like that are holding them back there. So once we remove that clog, things just flow a lot better. And that's what the release work does. It's not about fixing anyone. It's about getting rid of the things that aren't them, the things they've accumulated in their programming that allow them to go out and do all the cool things they want to do.
Okay, it's looking at how the interplay of the different factors, how your job influences your relationship at home, and how, when there's a fault with when there's a fault with one of them, how it influences your performance in the other aspect as well.
Yeah, there's a quote that I used to really believe. I remember I saw it on someone's refrigerator. It was a magnet on the refrigerator, and it said that everything you want is on the other side of fear. Well, I liked the idea at the time, and what I've come to realize now that I have these tools that can help people release the excess baggage and things of that nature, that I no longer believe everything you want is on the other side of fear. I think that, and I'm speaking you generally, not you specifically, Keenan, that I think that you don't know what you want because it's clouded by fear. And I have a personal example of this, that I used to think I didn't want to go skydiving because of my fear of heights. Well, I got rid of my fear of heights. Now I just don't want to go skydiving. The difference is that it's now me making the decision, not the phobia. And those are 2 drastically different ways of living life. That it's me making the decision, not the fear. End result still the same. Someone may argue, well, Ray, you still aren't jumping out of planes. You're right. The difference is now when I think about skydiving, my heart doesn't race. It's just something else I don't want to do, just like the millions and billions of other things that I just have no desire to do.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you look at fear, because something I wrote recently about, it ties in with fear, but it's, we have this belief in our mind that we are able to predict the future. That we believe if we do something, this will be the outcome. And a lot of the times, our own fear is dictated by this predictive ability that we have. We fear something because we predicted in our mind this will happen. But how often is that prediction actually right? How often have we predicted, if I go and talk to this person, oh, it's going to go so horrible, or if I go for this painting class, it's going to be so bad that everybody's going to be laughing at me. How often are those predictions actually true?
That reminds me, and please forgive me, I don't know who said this quote. It was something along the lines of, that's why we have these imaginations, right? Because then we can die in our head rather than actually die. So there is something to it. And yes, I do believe that if we look at, going back to that NLP model of communication, someone says, hey, let's go to a painting class. Well, based on attitudes, beliefs, values, memories, all of those things, well, then we form this internal representation of potentially the class going poorly, someone not liking our picture, which affects our state, which affects our physiology, which produces the behavior of us not going to the class. So yes, through these filters and based on what's presented to us, we start to form those things in our mind. And yeah, so I'm on board with that.
Okay, there's one thing that I've noticed with a lot of self-improvement, and that kind of gives it a bit of a bad rap. It's this focus on feeling good or feeling better as opposed to becoming better or working on things to become better. How do you navigate this where you're not just making somebody feel, oh, like I'm doing a good thing and I'm working towards a better place, but then actually that they are becoming better? Because something like feeling lacking a sense of self-worth has value for a lot of people. Like Bill Gates is a good example that comes to mind. He became successful literally because he thought he's not good enough, or whatever he's done up until that point wasn't good enough. And those sort of thoughts and emotions spurred him on to become better. Same with Elon Musk. He didn't want any of his father's money because he felt he has to earn his own place in the world.
So I can't speak directly to those two people, and yes, I appreciate the language you use there around feeling better and versus being better, and I've written a lot about this, so I appreciate you using that language here. That yes, I believe there's a lot of personal development out there that's designed to make people feel better. Now, I want to be clear that I don't think this is people wanting to hurt people. In some cases, there may be wanting to form a dependency because then people make more money if they keep coming back for your stuff, right? So and I don't think that's the general intention, right? And personal development is a very lucrative business. Like overall, when you look at the amount of money people spend on, books and seminars and that type of stuff. So yes, the way that I gauge that is right now, let's say you were to come to me and say, hey, I'm having a bad day. And I just said, hey, think of puppies, right? Maybe that makes you feel better in the moment. Maybe that puts a smile on your face and now you can go to the gym rather than feeling sad and not going to the gym. Sure. And in my mind, that's the way that I view that. And this may sound kind of extreme potentially for you or your audience, that I view personal development that does that almost like a drug or a drink. That's someone who after a hard day's work comes home and has a drink to calm down. Well, that's fine. Like no trouble with drinking. I would just say that, hey, does it require that, or do we have the ability ourselves to calm down? I think meditation for me is a great example here, that some people meditate to feel better, where I'm like, well, let's figure out how to feel better so then we can meditate to derive like the benefits above and beyond just relaxing, right? Because for me personally, my meditation practice has given me so much more. I don't meditate to relax anymore. There are things that now that I don't have to focus on that, I can actually get other benefits of what meditation can deliver. So yes, I think that when we start looking at personal development as something that does make us feel better, we miss out on all of the other things. And to answer that second part of your question of, well, how do we determine that? Well, when we start to operate according to our beliefs and values, we start to feel better. I'm speaking generally here, and sure, there may be some exceptions, that if someone is living a life out of alignment with what they believe is most important and out of a belief system and Now, could someone have beliefs that aren't driving toward what they desire? Sure. And we might call those limiting beliefs and things of that nature. So yes, we can identify the roadblocks and get rid of those so they can move on towards success. And yeah, if someone's living a life out of alignment and they know this because they feel it, and this is some of the language I've used with, or please forgive me, some of the language I've gotten from some of my clients, they use phrases or something like, life looked good on paper, it just didn't feel good. And I think people are aware of this, that for some people, they've just, it almost feels like they've given up because they've just said, oh, well, this is how life is. And I promise that for many people on the other side of those things that are holding them back or living a life that's out of alignment with their values and what's most important to them, life is just different. It's different. It doesn't just look good. It does feel good. The thing is, we don't start with the feel good. We start with making the changes, and the feel good is a byproduct, right? We just don't lead with the feeling good first, because feelings aren't facts, right? Like, yes, they can be indicators of things, and that can also be skewed by our programming.
Yeah, it's a tough place to be in because, especially if you have success, it's, why am I sad? And you might feel somewhat guilty for it. That I have all the success, but yet I don't feel fulfilled. And you can't really share it with others because it's going to be like, nobody's going to understand, because on the surface level, it looks like everything's going handy for me. Like it's, I'm in the perfect situation. It's, what's the word I'm looking for? It's the curse of success. It's a success in a space that you do not feel fulfilled, where you are running a race that you see others running. Sure, you are winning the race, but is it the race you actually want to be part of?
Right. And I think there, when it comes to that word success, and it's funny you use that one, that specific word for this example, that the definition of success is different for different people. And I've done, so there's an exercise I've done in large groups, like hundreds of people, right? Where I'll tell everyone, please write down the first 5 words that come to mind when you hear the word success. They list out everyone writes down 5 words. Then I'll ask someone to read their words, and someone will give 5 words that they think of when they think of success. And then I'll ask the rest of the audience, please raise your hand if you have the exact same 5 words as that person. I've never been in a group where someone has the exact same 5 words. I've never been in a group, even large groups, where they have the same 4 words. I've had a couple people, or, a handful of people raise at 3, more at 2, and then, there's several people that may have 1, and it's still not a majority of the group that has their hands up. And the reason why I believe that's so important is that if I'm in a job interview, for example, let's say you're interviewing me, Keenan, and you were to ask me, hey, Ray, do you want to be successful here? And I'm like, yes, I do. Show me the way, Keenan. And you're like, cool, I'm going to show you how to be successful. And in your head, success means like donating money to charities, going to church, donating time at the puppy shelter, all that type stuff. And then in my head, I'm thinking like casinos, late night helicopter rides through the Grand Canyon, and I'm thinking about all of these other things. We aren't having the same conversation. So I think that for someone to define success and then work toward what that is for them, that's what makes them feel better, not just thinking like positive thoughts or affirmations where in fact they're really just lying to themselves to try and convince themselves those things are true.
So how does one distinguish between the stated preferences, or not the stated, what somebody states is success to them versus how they act out? So you mentioned earlier that people's values will come through their actions, but if somebody is acting towards a certain measure of success, how do you help them distinguish between the two, whether this is their actual definition of success that aligns with their values?
That's a good question. So similar to how we identify beliefs, we look at actions, right? So I'll give an example of a client, and I think that this will resonate with a lot of people. I'm going to be vague. I won't give the specifics of this client's life. That when we look at values, let's look at I'm going to use some odd language here for values, and I'm just going to use occupation and finances, right? So we have occupation and finances. Let's say that those are how someone describes their values, like what they do, and then money, right? Well, I have a client that, looking at this client's past, what was happening was, or what they ended up doing in a couple different scenarios, was they ended up giving up a job that they didn't like to make less money elsewhere. Now, I've had other clients who will suffer through what they would describe as an intolerable job to make more money. So what this tells me is that if we were to look at their values, the client who quits a good paying job because they don't like to work to make less money elsewhere, for me that tells me that their occupation, what they're doing, is more important than the money they make. The person who will suffer through an intolerable job because they're making a lot of money, that would, again, I'm isolating this because I realize there are other factors here. So this is really just for the sake of the example. That would tell me that the money is more important than what they do. Now, we have outside circumstances, right? They have families they may need to support, like they're willing to do it for a handful of other reasons. And we can start to see hints of what's driving someone's behavior. So if someone is in a job that they don't like, and they don't feel like life is good, and they're making good money, well, if they were to potentially switch jobs, even making less money to do something that is in alignment with their beliefs and values, I mean, we can start to ask questions. Well, what's the difference between the two? Well, here I would have more autonomy versus here I'm micromanaged. Okay, cool. What's important about autonomy? Well, it allows me to express myself more fully, and being creative is important to me. Well, cool. What's important about being creative? Well, I just feel it gives other people permission to live the life they want. Well, that's cool to hear. And if someone's not doing that in a certain position, well, we can identify that as a value based on their behavior. So again, just like beliefs, we go back to looking at what people are doing and how they operate to start to identify what's important to them, because they're going to live those things out one way or another. And if they aren't living them out, they're going to feel it.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. So it's looking at the actions, but if their actions are actually making them feel guilty about it or bad about it, in negative in some capacity, that gives you information that this is actions going against their belief system. Okay, that makes perfect sense.
It's a good conversation starter to explore, right? It's worth investigating. Is it a perfect science there? Probably not. And it's at least worth the conversation.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything like a perfect science when you're dealing with people. There's always going to be a lot of dynamics at play, and each person is so unique. We each have unique experiences, and then in that situation also, it will be different to each of us. Ladies and gentlemen, today, Ciafardini. Thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast today. If people want to follow your work or connect with you, where can they go?
Thank you for asking. So my website is mycoachray, that's M as in Mary, YCOACHRAY.com. Now, I also have a link tree. So my website has my services and things of that nature on it. So there are some free services on there. So definitely take a look at that website. If you go to my link tree, which is RAYCIA, F as in Frank, AR, D as in David, INI, Junior, JR.com. If you go to my link tree, that's where you'll be able to find me on social media. You'll also be able to find the service is called Buy Me a Coffee, and that's where I post articles and have a membership on there. It's a low monthly price. It's like $10 or it's $10 a month. And I'm teaching NLP through these detailed articles. So my website, there are my services and some free services on there. And then my link tree, which I just gave, that's where my social media can be found, as well as the Buy Me a Coffee page with a bunch of free articles. And then there's a membership if people wanted to dig deeper into neuro-linguistic programming. So thank you for asking about that, Keenan.
Sweet. Yeah, if anybody's interested, I definitely advise go and check out the articles that Trey has on his website. They are well worth the read. If anything, go on any of your socials, like on Instagram. I know he has a page and he has links to all of the articles there, with the image representing the topic. Yeah. Thank you so much again for being a guest today. Have a good day. Cheers.
Thank you, Keenan.